Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start our next session. And I'm really honored to introduce two brilliant scholars. The first person I'll introduce is Shay Pilnik. Shay is the grandson of Holocaust survivors from Lithuania and Poland who immigrated to Israel from the former Soviet Union several decades ago, just as the Jewish state was liberated and founded. Dr. Pilnik is the new director of the Emil and Jenny Fish Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center at Yeshiva University in New York. Prior to acquiring this position, he was the executive director of the Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and he was there from 2014 to 2020. Under his leadership, the organization doubled in its outreach and capacity, serving schools and communities across Wisconsin, providing programs, lectures, teaching, workshops, and study abroad trips dealing with the Holocaust. Shay received his a bachelor's degree from Hebrew University in Jerusalem and his MA at Jewish Studies at McGill University, and he did his doctorate degree at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the field of modern Jewish studies. His PhD dealt with the Babi Yar massacre in Soviet Russia, and also he dealt with Yiddish literature. After Shay will lead off this session, and after Shay, I'm really pleased that David Patterson is with us again. He's been teaching on our program for several years, and he's also on our academic executive committee, and really has become a leader in ISGAP and a mentor and a dear friend, and a leading scholar on important issues dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism set and rooted in a solid historical framework, which is very important to understanding contemporary challenges. David holds the Hillel Feinberg Distinguished Chair of Holocaust Studies at the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas in Dallas. He's a commissioner on the Texas Holocaust and Genocides Commission, a member of the executive board of academic advisors for the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, ISGAP, and a member of the executive board of the annual Scholars Conference on the Holocaust and Churches. David is a winner of the National Jewish Book Award, the Correct Jewish Book Award, and the Holocaust Studies Scholars Conference Eternal Flame Award. He has published many books, more than 35 books, and over 250 articles and book chapters dealing with literature, philosophy, the Holocaust, and Jewish studies. His most recent book is Shoah and Torah. It's forthcoming from SUNY Publications. And he wrote Elie Wiesel's Hasidic Legacy, which is also coming out with SUNY. He also wrote The Holocaust as Non-Representable in 2008, and Antisemitism and its Metaphysical Origins, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. So David will be speaking about anti-Semitism from Hitler to Hamas, and to lead off, Shay will be speaking Memory Without Memories, the story of Babi Yar. So Shay, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Charles, how much time do I have until 11? Should I take 30 minutes from now?
25 minutes.
Okay, so before I start, I ask Ira, do you have my PowerPoint presentation ready? Or shall I share the screen? I can share the screen. Before we talk about logistics, I wanted to thank all of you, thank you all for being a part of both the study and the battle against anti-Semitism, for viewing actually anti-Semitism as a current ongoing phenomenon, and for linking it to the greater theme of hatred. I'm only going to contribute here my part, my small part, but I would like to encourage you to afterwards go to the Emil and Jenny Fish Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center at Yeshiva University's new website that was just put up a couple of days ago. This is a program in a building stage. Charles mentioned the fact that I was the head of the center in Milwaukee for over 5 years. In fact, I left Milwaukee last week And I don't know if you can see in the background, but there's an empty space behind me just because I moved into our new house in Stamford, Connecticut only a couple of days ago. I imagine that the Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies will have a great role to play in shaping the way the Holocaust is taught and studied and researched in North America and perhaps around the world. I'm here to share with you the story. So we wanted to talk about anti-Semitism. I wanted to share with you the story that is based on a PhD dissertation that I submitted at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2013 for a PhD in the field of modern Jewish studies. This is a project that I'm currently in the process of turning into a book. Very little has been written, to the best of my knowledge, no monograph, about actually a fairly central subject in Soviet culture and Soviet Jewish history. And that's the way that Babi Yar, which is not only one of the most important Holocaust era sites, but also one of the symbols, perhaps the symbol of the Holocaust as it played itself out in the Soviet Union. One thing methodologically and pedagogically I hate to do, but I'm going to do right now, is turn to a PowerPoint presentation. Normally, I would like to speak to people and that they can see. I don't believe that the slideshow should be the teacher. People should look at the instructor. But due to the time constraints, as they say, I'm going to, so Ira, I'm going to do it from here. I'm going to first of all share screen. And you let me know if it works.
Looks good.
Looks good? Okay. So I'm actually going to talk about the impact of memory at a place when there's actually no memorials. James Young, in his fascinating survey of Holocaust memorials, in the introduction for his book, did actually talk about the fact that sometimes the memorial, the monument, tends to replace the actual, tends to, I would say, replace, but also do the work of memory instead of letting people do it themselves. Sometimes people, in a way, lay the expectation on the memorial that it would remember events for them. And over time, people walk by a statue, a slab of stone, they don't even remember what the stone represents. Babi Yar is the really story of the diametric opposite of a memorial, that of a memory of a tragic event, a catastrophic event, that for many, many years did not have any memorial, any monument, any physical space that would signify what actually happened. And the responsibility for remembering was actually laid on the shoulders of the community. Babi Yar is also a symbol for a different type of murder. I would say a double murder. My dissertation, my research did not concern the murder process. A lot has been written about that, done by the Germans, but rather the murder of memory. So the Soviet regime did not engage in the mass murder of Jews, but it did engage in certain periods in the mass murder of Jewish culture, the Jewish religion, and Judaism. The story at large, I would say, concerns, when we think about the Holocaust at large, concerns the Holocaust by bullets. The Holocaust by bullets is a coinage termed by Father Patrick de Bois, a Catholic priest, who was looking for a way to label a specific process during the Holocaust at large, namely the outbreak of World War II on the Eastern Front and Operation Barbarossa. For anyone who has some familiarity with the history of the Holocaust, this is truly when the Holocaust becomes the final solution. The first victims of the final solution are the Jews of the Soviet Union. Jews in communities on the western frontier of the Soviet Union who are confronted by the Einsatzgruppen, those special units. What's unique about the Holocaust at this stage is that the Soviet regime is murdering Jews by shooting, by mass shooting, a process that later gives way to the murder of Jews in gas facilities, in the death camps. What happened briefly between September 29th to 30th, 1941, is that over 33,000 Jews, the members of the Jewish community in Kiev. Kiev is essentially the first city in Europe to become first major city, first European capital to become Judenrein, who have been rounded up, led to a ravine on the northwestern outskirts of the city called Babi Yar. This is a place that Jews had fondly remembered before as a place for hiking, to go on a picnic outside town. Over 33,000 of them were murdered at the site. This is one of the greatest ravines. It's also known as one of the most, or perhaps the most rapid massacre to take place in the entire Holocaust. The 33,700 Jews murdered in Babi Yar, you can see here in the photo. This is the ravine. I believe the photo shows you the preparations for the killing. They were killed within 36 hours. So it took a day and a half to kill them. It was one of the most rapid murders. This is not the largest massacre during the Holocaust or in the Soviet Union, but perhaps because it was in Kiev, in a major city, perhaps because of the rapidity of the murder, this place came to symbolize the Holocaust by bullets. I mentioned the fact that close to 34,000 Jews were murdered, but Babi Yar, in total, some estimates vary. I will give you the lower figure. There's estimates that by the end of the war, there were 100,000 people who were murdered at the site. Now, I say people deliberately, I did not say Jews, though estimates are that about 90,000 of them, 90% of them were actually Jewish. But Babi Yar became also a murder site for other enemies of the Nazi regime, meaning Red Army soldiers, POWs, Communist Party activists, members of the party, all sorts of Soviet bureaucrats who were murdered in this site. In other words, both Jews and enemies, Soviet enemies of the Nazi regime. And that's why, in a way, we can imagine Babi Yar to be a focal point, a memory focal point, to be fair, for both meta-narratives. In a way, we can imagine two non-concentric circles with an area of overlap, which is Babi Yar. What am I trying to say, in other words? That Babi Yar became a site for both Jews and non-Jews. It became a Holocaust site. It should have become a Holocaust site officially, particularly because what the Nazis did, insofar as the Jewish population was concerned, is apply a policy of genocide. They decided that infants, women, no matter what age, the crime of being Jewish, they would be brought there and be killed. But also, the site became a memory focal point for people to commemorate what the Soviet regime would call after the war the Great Patriotic War. So here we see how two great memories are overlapping. The Great Patriotic War was a Soviet meta-narrative that did not speak about the Jews in general, but rather about the brotherhood of all peoples, all Soviet nations that suffered during the war. To suggest, in other words, that this is an exclusively Jewish site would be historically wrong. And as we will see later, some activists, scholars, writers did look at it only as a Jewish site. I talked about the murder of memory, because what's most important is that the Soviet regime after the war does not know what to do with the site. And in fact, it decides not to commemorate, not to link Babi Yar, I would say to link Babi Yar to neither the Great Patriotic War nor to the Holocaust. In the Soviet Union, there is no discourse about the Holocaust per se. There is no term for that. Let's not forget that the term Shoah or Holocaust are Western terms. There is some references to the Katastrophe, but for the most part, the Holocaust is a subject that is pretty much low-key, gray zone, and I will show you in a moment, never really banned. At the same time, the Soviet regime realizes that the site is too dangerous to only associate with the Great Patriotic War. After all, 90% of those murdered there were Jewish. I mentioned the close to 34,000, but during the war, there's multiple campaigns of shooting ranges, shooting cycles that take place at the site. So what the Soviet regime decides to do is to simply forget about the site and hope that the population, both Jewish and non-Jewish, would do the same. At some point in 1961, they even decide to completely flood the place. Actually, earlier than that, I'm sorry. Back in the 50s, they decide to flood the place and to construct a recreational park with a soccer stadium right on top of it. I will show you, here's a photo of statues, monuments commemorating the Yama, which is another site associated with the Holocaust by bullets in Minsk, in Belarus in 1947. What am I showing you in this photo? I'm showing you a proof that the Soviet regime was very uncomfortable about associating what happened during the war with the Jews. They used to look at it as Zvi Gittelman, Professor Zvi Gittelman said, as giving the war away to the Jews. For them, the story of the war as a burden borne by members of many nations was very important. At the same time, you can see that there was no ban, there was no universal ban on all Holocaust monuments. In Babi Yar, nothing. The regime would disperse people who gather there. At some point, Babi Yar turns into a dumping ground, a place where the city would dump garbage. But here in Minsk, for instance, they did allow a monument to be constructed in 1947. At the very height, I have to say, of the Stalinistic campaigns against Jews. Some of you have heard of Stalin's campaign against, anti-Semitic campaign against ruthless cosmopolitans, which took place right after the birth of the State of Israel from 48 to 52. In other words, the Soviet regime never really had I would say, a uniform policy vis-a-vis Holocaust commemoration. Viktor Nekrasov was the first Russian intellectual writer who protested in Literaturnaya Gazeta, in a major Russian publication, literary publication, who protested the attempt to erase the site. Is that possible? Who could think of that? To fill a ravine 30 meters deep and to make merry and play football where the greatest tragedy took place. No, it's impermissible. There's two interesting developments. In 1959, we start to see, first with Nekrasov, then with some of his colleagues, the emergence of two things. First of all, non-Jews who deeply care about Babi Yar. Those who really pick up the banner of protesting the Soviet government's policy. And I do have to say, the policy of forgetting Babi Yar, and that's why I present it in this forum, was clearly underpinned by anti-Semitism. Stalin had harsh anti-Semitic policies, both persecuting Jewish cultural activists and dismantling all Jewish, all existing, hitherto existing Jewish cultural institutions. Khrushchev was a more, I would say, a more traditional, folksy, he had a peasant background, anti-Semite, who made a lot of inappropriate, we would say today, a lot of politically incorrect comments about Jews, their greediness. But also in the 60s, we see a time when there is a renewed attack against Jews, dismantling of synagogues, etc. So it's interesting, two things that we see here with Viktor Nekrasov. Then we will move to Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who was a more famous case. We see here non-Jews who care about Babi Yar, and also we see the rise for the first time ever of protest, dissent, or dissidents within the Soviet Union. Yevgeny Yevtushenko wrote the poem Babi Yar. He became, through the poem, by virtue of the poem Babi Yar, he became an international cultural icon. Here you see his portrait appearing on the very front page of Time magazine in the spring of 1962. For classical music lovers, some of you remember that Dmitri Shostakovich, one of the greatest composers of the 20th century, and perhaps the greatest Soviet composer other than Prokofiev, subtitled his 13th Symphony Babi Yar, which sets to music the poem written by Yevtushenko. It's interesting that both Yevtushenko and Nekrasov, I would say Yevtushenko more than Nekrasov, engage in what Soviet scholars call cultural diplomacy. What's cultural diplomacy? Dina Speckler, historian Dina Speckler, has actually a more interesting term to describe that, called permitted dissent. In other words, these are people who oppose the Soviet regime. Yevgeny Yevtushenko aroused the ire of none other than Khrushchev when he wrote the poem and Khrushchev read it. But at the same time, these are people who do not go to the Gulag. They are all active in an era during the Soviet history known as the thaw period or Khrushchev's thaw. 1961, there's actually a renewed thaw, the second thaw. It's a time when the Soviet regime is actually interested in greater openness and allowing criticism of the regime. Permitted dissent, for some of you, may sound like an oxymoron. In other words, the regime won't allow any protest. It does allow protest in some realms that it recognizes as beneficial to it. So when Yevgeny Yevtushenko still remains...
Shay, sorry to interrupt. 5 more minutes, please. Sorry.
Yeah, Yevgeny Yevtushenko still, thank you. Yevgeny Yevtushenko is still remembered as a controversial figure. He passed away a couple of years ago. Some see him as the greatest hero of the Jewish people and a true, genuine Soviet poet, Soviet intellectual who confronted the Soviet regime, one of the first to confront it. Others see him essentially as a court poet. Joseph Brodsky, the Jewish poet, there was no love lost between the two of them, who saw Yevtushenko essentially as a pseudo-dissident who was operating within the Soviet regime. I would say that for our story, the story of Babi Yar, Yevtushenko did publish the work at great risk. It's interesting, in my work, what I did was to compare both Russian and Yiddish poets. Russian poets and writers. The Russian writers, needless to say, some of them were Jewish, some were not, but primarily they were Gentiles who cared about Babi Yar's memory. The Yiddish ones, of course, were all Yiddish poets. Here you can see in 1962 that there were some unofficial commemorations in other sites. This is a time when the nascent Jewish national movement arises in the Soviet Union, and those Holocaust sites in Riga, in Vilna, in Kiev, in Minsk become in a way focal points for young people to recover their Jewish identity. Here's another ceremony at Babi Yar in 1972. You can see Jews standing next to a very small slab that the government still allowed to mark Babi Yar. If I show you what the Soviet government ultimately, I would say because of Yevtushenko, concede to do, is to put up a monument in 1976 that was a socialist realist monument, a monument that commemorated the Great Patriotic War. So here, the Soviet government, after many years of pressure, decided that Babi Yar is allowed to be a focal point for the Soviet memory, but not for the Jewish memory. Things actually get worse. In 1981, due to international pressure, the Soviet regime allowed to include a Yiddish inscription in the plaque underneath this monument that you see. And the plaque in Yiddish made no reference to Jews being murdered at the site whatsoever. I'm going to skip a little bit. I mentioned Yiddish writers. In 1962, for the first time, the Soviet regime allows, for the first time after over a decade, the Soviet regime allowed the appearance of one Yiddish publication in the Soviet Union. This is a history too long to cover in half an hour, but there was a time in the Soviet Union where Jews had government-run and government-funded museums, orchestras, choirs, research institutes, and primarily schools. All that was gone under Stalin. In 1961, for the first time, Sovetish Heimland, or the Soviet Heimland, appears as the only Yiddish publication in the Soviet Union. A very, I would say, bona fide communist publication. You can read about it in Yiddish, hymns praising Lenin and the revolution, and you only had to read between the lines to find any mentioning of Jewish life or the Holocaust that was genuine and profound. Here's an example of an illustration that I found in the journal. My work was to sift through the thousands of pages of the journal and look for any evidence about Babi Yar. So here's an image of 3 women at Babi Yar. These are always women. They're never Jewish women. In my research, I came upon a number of Yiddish writers. They were all residents of Kiev who came after the war, minor writers. One of them is Dori Chaikine. The other one is Shloyma Cherniavasky. When you analyze their works, you see that they only obliquely refer to Babi Yar. You really have to know the topography of Kiev. You need to know, to look for cues in order to realize that they're actually writing poems in Yiddish that mourn the members of their own immediate family members at the site. Shloyma Cherniavasky is a very good example. I would actually like to conclude by reading you a poem that could have been, I would say, in terms of artistic quality, should be no less important than Yevgeny Yuvetushenko's poem. I will conclude by way of reading the poem. This is a poem that only appeared in print in a Russian translation, never in the original. The original is still in Kiev in the archive. It appeared in a teeny tiny book in Russian that appeared in a tirage, in a circulation of about, I think, 3,000 copies. That's it, or maybe even less, maybe 2,000 copies. And the translation is mine. What I think the comparison between Cherniavasky and Dori Chaikine and these great Russian writers shows is that you could protest Babi Yar, the lack of any memorial at Babi Yar, only if you were non-Jewish, only if you made very vague claims about the Holocaust, like Nekrasov and Yevtushenko did. But if you were Jewish, if you were a Yiddish writer, if you wanted to refer to the fact that Babi Yar is a Holocaust site, if you wanted to link Babi Yar to Auschwitz, to Treblinka, to the same history, you would be extremely careful. So here's Shlomo Cherniavasky's Babi Yar. That bygone year of 44, the soul has turned blind from sorrow. Once again, the wind will carry clouds of ash over Babi Yar. A little child's shoe lies on the grass. It's half rotten. But where's the child? The mother's hands, she's half awake. They wander over the child's head. They touch upon his gentle cheeks. They slide not hands but shadows. A child's shoe rots here on the grass, but whose? And who will put it on? Over Babi Yar the winds whistle. What was in vain and what was not. The leaves are flying over Babi Yar. A leaf descends on a shoe. You can see, by the way, in the poem, no mentioning of Jews. The word Jews, the word Jewish. The only, I would say, in a metonymous way, in a very oblique way, the only hint we have that Cherniavasky is describing the murder of Jews rather than non-Jews at Babi Yar is, of course, the reference to the child's shoe, to the mother. Jews were the only ones who were victimized at Babi Yar, not for their opinions or political affiliation, but rather for the crime of being Jewish. I would like to thank you for listening to this presentation.
Shay, thank you very much. It's you just gave an important presentation, not only about the history, but also the banalization, as they say in French, or the minimization of the Holocaust in history and Soviet history. And I think the minimization of anti-Semitism then and now, and how people are portraying Jewish history and Jewish memory then in the former Soviet Union, and even now in the United States of America, as we see the discourse shifting rapidly in different parts of the world. So on this note, I think David Patterson will be speaking now on anti-Semitism from Hitler and Hamas, and his work is, I think, crucial to this whole conversation. So David, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Ira, can you give me control of my screen?
Sure. You should have the ability to share.
Okay.
There you are.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Charles. Thank you to the participants for having the courage to engage such a topic as this. Anti-Semitism in its quintessential manifestation can be seen, in my view, in National Socialism. I mean, that's the end game of the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. It's Auschwitz. So the question is, now that since in the aftermath of the extermination of the Jews of Europe, where does anti-Semitism go in its, in its National Socialist-like forms? This is an image of one of the kites sent over Israel with incendiary devices from Gaza. And you may have seen these images. Why can't I share? Oh, here we go. There are, as I will show, lines of influence and lines of parallels between Nazi anti-Semitism and Islamic jihadist anti-Semitism. I say Islamic jihadist and not Muslim because I think jihadism has its own characteristics, its own features. And you'll see these lines from Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf was published in 1924 with reference to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And there are a few references to the protocols in the Hamas Charter of Allah.
David, I'm sorry to interrupt. For the students, could you explain what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is?
Yes. 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 The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a phony set of notes supposedly taken in secret meetings by the Jewish leaders of the world plotting to take over the world. It was compiled between 1897 and 1899 under the direction of a Russian secret police guy named Pyotr Ivanovich Rachkovsky. It was, Rachkovsky based a lot of it on two novels from the 1860s. One novel is called Biarritz by Hermann Goethe. The other is called Dialogue in Hell by Maurice Joly. It was initially published in 1903 in the Russian periodical Znamya, which is the banner. And after that, Sergei Alexandrovich Nilus undertook the distribution of the protocols. The protocols found wide distribution following the First World War, which was a huge catastrophe that hit the world. And of course, the Jews were in many quarters to blame for it. So the protocols was read widely in Germany immediately after the war. Hitler obviously was familiar with it, and it was translated into Arabic in 1926. Okay. Now, how do we get from Hitler to Hamas? Haj Amin al-Husseini is a key figure in these connections, in unfolding these connections. Al-Husseini was in the Turkish army during the First World War. He was stationed in areas where the mass murder of Armenians took place, although the extent of his direct involvement is, as far as I can tell, not clear. He was charged by the British mandate in Palestine in 1920 for inciting riots in 1920. He was found guilty in absentia. On May 8th, 1921, the mandate governor, Herbert Samuel, appointed him Mufti of Jerusalem in an effort to appease the Arab population. Al-Husseini reacted by declaring a jihad against the British and the Jews. Al-Husseini went on to incite a number of other riots. In 1933, March 31st, 1933, he had his first meeting with the new Nazi German consul in Jerusalem. Hitler came to power on January 30th, 1933 as chancellor. By the end of March, Dachau was up and running, the longest operating concentration camp. And Al-Husseini had his meeting with the German consul right away. He lost no time in doing that. And beginning in 1933, he developed deep ties with the Nazis. He once again was involved in inciting what's known as the Arab Revolt in 1936, and he did so with substantial financial aid from Nazi Germany. Matthias Kunzel has written quite a bit on this period. One of the scholars, he says that the Arab Revolt took place against the background of the swastika. Youth organizations paraded as Nazi scouts, and Arab children greeted each other with a Nazi salute. In 1936, the German Foreign Ministry issued a statement explaining that the Nuremberg laws of 1935 pertained only to Jews, not to Arabs. The Arabs were not to be counted among the Semites, basically, as the Jews were. On October 2nd, 1937, Al-Husseini had a meeting with Adolf Eichmann and Herbert Hagen in Palestine, although some sources say that Eichmann didn't make the meeting. Others say he did. In any case, he was in close contact with the elites of Nazi Germany. And on the 13th of October, 1937, once again, Al-Husseini had to flee as he was once again wanted for inciting riots. Meanwhile, here's the other important piece to the link between Hitler and Hamas, between Nazis and jihadists later. In March 1928, Hassan al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood in Cairo. This is their creed. Allah is our goal, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law. You might think, okay, so far so good, but then jihad is our way. Jihad, of course, means killing. It means purifying. The Muslim Brotherhood was heavily influenced by Salafism, which is a purist movement. The jihadists are purists, as the Nazis were purists. Beware of people who want to purify humanity. And it's in many parts of the world, the contagion that humanity has to be purified of is Jews and Judaism. So jihad it involves, killing Jews and others for the sake of Allah. Now, al-Banna was a great admirer of Hitler. He indicated that Hitler opened his eyes to the fact that the Zionist movement, as Hitler says in Mein Kampf, was not about establishing a haven or a homeland for the Jews. It was about establishing a base of operations for taking over the world. And of course, we have the proof in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Al-Banna also learned about propaganda, he says, from Hitler. And he learned the importance of propaganda and the purpose of propaganda. The purpose, he realized, is not to inform, certainly. It's not even to persuade. The purpose of propaganda is to incite. And as Hitler put it, its purpose is to incite wrathful hatred. In 1938, the Brotherhood by 1938, they had established their own contact with Nazi Germany. They were sending delegations to Nuremberg rallies. This was with the help of Haj Amin al-Husseini, making the connection. In 1938, they had a conference in October in Cairo at which they passed out copies, Arabic language copies of portions of Mein Kampf. There wasn't a complete translation of Mein Kampf in Arabic at that time. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. These, by the way, are not copies of what they passed out. These are later editions. This Arabic language edition of Mein Kampf was translated by Louis Al-Haj, a former Nazi and convert to Islam. And in his introduction, he describes Hitler as someone who was carrying out jihad. Meanwhile, Haj Amin al-Husseini, once again, is back in business on the payroll of the Nazis. And keep in mind what you just heard from Shay about the dates, the Babi Yar, the timing. On June 22nd, 1941, the Nazis moved to the east. They had planned to move on May 1st, but they got held up in the Balkans. On April 3rd, 1941, al-Husseini led a coup, which was financed by the Nazis, led a coup against the British-backed Iraqi government in Baghdad. The British managed to regain control of Baghdad, but not before on June 1st, 1941, a riot against the Jews known as the Farhud took place, killing more than 600 Jews. Al-Husseini fled once again and ended up in Berlin, where on November 28th, 1941, he had his first sit down with Hitler. And in his memoirs, he recalls that the following, he says, our fundamental condition for cooperation with Germany was a free hand to eradicate every last Jew from Palestine and the Arab world. I asked Hitler for an explicit undertaking to allow us to solve the Jewish problem in a manner befitting our national and racial aspirations, and according to the scientific methods innovated by Germany. The answer I got was the Jews are yours. Now, al-Husseini was broadcasting propaganda in Arabic language over 6 radio stations. One of his repeated refrains was that to kill a Jew pleases Allah. Now here we have a very important difference between Nazi anti-Semitism and jihadist. The Nazis are trying to purify this world of the Jewish presence, to make this world Judenrein. It's an ontological utopia that they're seeking. For the jihadists, the killing Jews becomes a holy act pleasing to God. It becomes a religious obligation and a means into paradise. Okay, this is an important difference. So al-Husseini had extensive contact with various people in the SS and the camp system. He was close to Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz, Franz Zierreis of Mauthausen, Siegfried Seidel of Theresienstadt, Franz Kramer and Bergen-Belsen. But the one he was closest to was Heinrich Himmler. Working with Himmler, al-Husseini organized, recruited thousands of Muslims to serve in SS killing units in the Balkans. Some estimates are as high as 100,000 Muslims recruited. Frankly, to me, that sounds a little high, but in any case, there were tens of thousands. Mostly Muslims from the Balkans. Most of them were not Arabs. Each unit had its mullah. The most infamous division, the unit was the Hanschar division, which had more than 21,000. And the commander of that unit, Carl Gustav Zabretzweig, says the Muslims see in our Führer the mission of a second prophet. And indeed, the Nazis floated the idea of promoting Hitler as the 12th Imam in the Shiite world, but they decided that might not fly. Here we have a photo of Al-Husseini and the Hanschar division. The man here on the far right is Zabretzweig, the commander of the unit. Because of his activities in the Balkans and with the killing units, Al-Husseini was a wanted Nazi war criminal. There were more than 150,000 named Nazi war criminals. They weren't all German, by the way. There were many from the East and from the West, as far as that goes. So Al-Husseini turned up on June 20th, 1946, and this is where, you know, the Al-Husseini and the Nazi Al-Husseini gets very tight with the Brotherhood. Even he was already tight with them, but here he becomes officially part of the system of the Brotherhood. He was welcomed by Hassan al-Banna as a hero. He was hailed as a great jihadist, fighting the cause of the Brotherhood in Europe over those recent years. He also, at that time, met Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb is an extremely important figure, probably the most influential ideologue of the Brotherhood. Qutb was and is read throughout the Muslim world. The Ayatollah Khomeini translated Qutb into Farsi. Abdullah Azzam of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri of Al-Qaeda were all deeply influenced by Qutb. Certainly, Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, profoundly influenced by Qutb. Qutb was executed, by the way, in 1966 under the Nasser regime in Egypt. I mean, they viewed the Brotherhood as a subversive element. Qutb is, one of his most famous works is called Milestones. He also has an important work called Our Struggle with the Jews, in which he explains that the Jews are satanic, demonic, doing the work of Satan, doing the work of evil. Now, here's another important point about anti-Semitism. For the anti-Semite, it isn't that all Jews are evil. No, it's that all evil is Jewish. So the purification of the world, the redemption of the world, the salvation of humanity, and this is in their language, it rests upon the elimination of the Jews from the world by any means necessary. Yassin founded Hamas on December 9th, 1987. His slogan was that killing Israelis, by which he also means Jews, is a holy act pleasing to God. It's a religious obligation. It's not an unpleasant necessity, as Himmler thought of it. It's a religious obligation, okay? And these are some selections from the Charter of Allah, and notice it's not the Hamas Charter. It's the Charter of Allah. Hamas is Allah, okay? Hamas has appropriated the word of Allah. In the Charter, there are basically three different sorts of proof texts, you know, texts that are cited to demonstrate the truth of what is stated in the Charter. One is the Quran. Another is the text from a huge body of writings known as the Hadith. The teachings attributed to the Prophet that didn't find their way into the Quran. And the third is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And notice this text. Notice the eschatology attached to the anti-Semitism here, as invoked in the Al-Bukhari Hadith. The Prophet, bless him, grant him salvation, has said, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims kill the Jews. The stones and trees will say, O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Nature itself vomits up the Jew. The Jew is an unnatural blight on the landscape, right? Just some other examples from the charter. There's no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. You can't negotiate. To negotiate is to betray Islam. Not just because Palestine, so-called, is part of the Waqf, the previously occupied Muslim lands, not that that's part of it, but also it's not just now occupied by non-Muslims, it's now defiled by Jews, you see. And so, there's the Article 15 ends with this refrain, I will assault and kill, assault and kill, assault and kill in the path of jihad for the sake of Allah, for the sake of humanity. I will become a martyr. And notice how murder morphs into martyrdom when this theological baggage gets imposed on the situation. Here's an example of, the Zionist invasion. That is, the Jews, are the source of all evil. They use all evil. They destroy values. They deteriorate character. They're behind the drug trade and alcoholism. And there are all kinds of other interesting and fantastic accusations. They smuggle carcinogenic shampoo into Egypt so that the Egyptians will get cancer, this kind of thing. Right. And notice, what is the evil? It's not just Israelis, it's not the Zionists merely, it's Israel, Judaism, and Jews. These are one and the same here. The expansionists, Canard, that Palestine is a base of operations for expansion from the Nile to the Euphrates and beyond. It's for world domination. The occupied territory is the planet Earth. It's not the West Bank or Gaza or Palestine. How do we know? It says so in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, it's often thought that, it's because of the Israelis that and what they do, what they occupy, what their policies are, and so on, that Jews around the world are attacked. If the Israelis defend themselves from missiles coming out of Gaza, Jews in Saskatchewan come under attack. The Salafist Sheikh, Mohammed Hussein Yaqub, explains, no, that's not the case at all. In a broadcast on Al-Rahma television, January 17th, 2009, he says the following: if the Jews left Palestine to us, would we start loving them? They are enemies, not because they occupied Palestine. They would have been enemies if they did not occupy a thing. Our fighting with the Jews is eternal. Not until a single Jew remains on the face of the earth. So it's not over. Why? Because the Jew is the contagion. The Jew is the source of evil. The Jew is the source of disease, whether it's coronavirus or police violence. The Jew is the source of whatever the evil might be, and the battle against the Jew is unrelenting. So I think one of the differences between Nazi anti-Semitism, jihadist anti-Semitism, is that the Nazis would usurp God. The Nazis, the voice of the Fuhrer takes the place of God. Right? The word of the Fuhrer is law. Now, this is similar, except the Fuhrer described himself in Mein Kampf, before he was Fuhrer, as doing God's work, but he never made statements like the Ayatollah Khomeini, who said that he is speaking God's word, and to oppose him is to oppose God, to oppose the state is to oppose God, right? So there's this jihadist appropriation of God. Hamas is Allah. Finishing up. These were Hitler's last words, last written words before he committed suicide.
He knows.
In 1945. His last political testament, as it's called, he ended it by saying to the world, he says, I enjoin the world to resist mercilessly the poisoner of all nations, international Jewry. Now we find, as we know, we've seen in the last few hours, that anti-Semitism is a global phenomenon. It can be found in all kinds of modes and disguises even, sometimes not disguised. It doesn't seem to be confined to a political party or position. I think this is because it is a metaphysical phenomenon. It's not a political or social or cultural phenomenon. Okay. Who has most systematically, most piously heeded this call? I would argue it's Islamic jihadists, starting with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood and its influence, the influence of the Brotherhood is vast. The resources are vast. They're on college campuses, they're in Muslim organizations throughout North America and Europe, throughout the world. Most of the jihadist movements today can trace their origins to the Brotherhood. I'm talking about Islamic Republic of Iran, Al-Qaeda, Sudan, Hassan al-Turabi was Brotherhood. Hezbollah, Hamas identifies itself as a branch of the Brotherhood. Various African movements, Al-Shabaab is an Al-Qaeda branch. ISIS came out of Al-Qaeda. So you have this network of believers who are responding to the Fuhrer's call. All anti-Semitism has to be taken seriously, whether it's the sons of the Ku Klux Klan or Hamas. But I'm suggesting that Islamic jihadism is one of the most widespread and dangerous areas where we find, the heirs to Hitler. These are actually not Hamas guys; they're Hezbollah, but you get the idea. Thank you. That's all I have for right now.
Thank you, David. Okay, so thank you. So thank you, David, and thank you, Shay. So I'm going to lead off with a question to you, David, and to Shay. So David, you're writing a book. I think it's forthcoming, or no, it was published in 2018, called "The Holocaust and the Non-Representable."
Yes.
And here in less than an hour, we heard from Shay, who gave I think a very important analysis of a tiny story within the Holocaust, where 33,000 people, 33,700 people were killed in 36 hours. in a systemic movement that exterminated Jews over a course of time. Over 6 million Jews exterminated. European Jewry decimated. The people who survived fled to Israel, to Palestine, to other parts of the world. And we were speaking about the three phases of anti-Semitism: the attack on Jewish peoplehood, the attack on Jews as a race, the attack on Jews as a Judaism, Jewish people belonging to the wrong religion. And, you know, I don't even know where to begin my question, but I was thinking, you were speaking of Hamas, I was thinking of kind of the discourse that's emerging in the United States. We have the racist, the white supremacist, which Joel Finkelstein will look at in a presentation, I think, in the next day or two, looking at the radicalization of young white people in the United States very rapidly. We see this whole discourse emerging, becoming public, finally becoming public, because it was sort of underground for a while. People coming out of the Nation of Islam, also with a replacement theory that's ingrained in the teachings of the Nation of Islam, which is connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. So Israel is a racist place. Jews is white privilege. We were dealing with, in the previous lecture, we have a system of social theory of knowledge. We refer to people like Hannah Arendt, who was dating a Nazi, Franz Rosenzweig, and other Jewish intellectuals that emerge out of Europe who have a difficult relationship to their own Jewish identity and certainly to the state of Israel. And these are the go-to people of social theory within the academy. And then we have this whole sort of postmodern moment where we have people like Michel Foucault and Edward Said, who were proponents of the Iranian Revolution, Judith Butler, Cornel West, looking at the racist apartheid entity that the Zionists and the Jews are. But this is sort of the onslaught of this sort of intellectual moment. And yet, David, when you do your presentation, clearly, unequivocally, we see the victims of the Nazi apartheid occupation connected to the real Nazis, ideologically connected, still connected to this sort of white supremacy. And I think students of anti-Semitism need to realize the connection between white supremacy and Nazism to the Muslim Brotherhood, to Hamas, and sort of this, we call it the Red-Green Alliance. People on the extreme left, the extreme postmodernists like Judith Butler, who can have the audacity to say that Hamas and Hezbollah must be understood as the progressive left. These are people who are not only committed to the extermination of all Jewish people and the eradication of the state of Israel, they call for the subjugation of women, the killing of gay people, and the doing away or creating second-class citizens for others. So, David, how do we deal with this sort of moment where critical contemporary anti-Semitism studies is not on the academic map? Many of us here are not versed in the study of contemporary anti-Semitism. We've already heard many of our well-meaning colleagues kind of, you know, in the name of decency, kind of come up and promote some of these tropes. How do we begin to kind of unpack this and deal with contemporary anti-Semitism, given the legacy that you've pointed to, and given, I think, the speeding up of extremists who are using anti-Semitism in the contemporary context to demonize who Jews are and what Israel is? How do we deal with this as intellectuals, as scholars?
Well, thank you for that easy question.
Yeah.
I think we have to begin with where Rabbi Zweig began last night. We have to begin with asking, what is the anti-Semite anti? Okay. We have to begin with, as we began, by noting that what starts with the Jews doesn't end with the Jews, but we have to then ask, why not? Okay, these two questions are related. You mentioned Jewish people, Jewish religion, Jewish culture, but it all, I mean, who the Jews are lies in the Torah. It lies in the voice of God putting to each of us the questions put to Cain. Where's your brother and what have you done? It lies in a certain understanding of humanity that Rabbi Zweig pointed out, that each of us is connected to the other physically and spiritually, okay? By our responsibility, not just by our, physical origin. So the anti-Semite goes to Adam's default mode of hiding from the question, where's your brother, what have you done? Hiding from, and trying to silence or eliminate the one through whom that question comes to the world, the Jews. The presence of the Jews in the world is the presence of a question concerning my humanity, who I am as a human being. Am I there for my fellow human being? And of course, we're never there enough. We are never enough. So the account is never settled. So the Jews are the keepers of the ledgers of the world. They tell us we're always in arrears, okay? That's what we're trying to eliminate. So I think the more people who can see the why of anti-Semitism, the farther along we can get when it comes to battling anti-Semitism. I mean, I could say more, I've written more, I could go on if you like, but just for the sake of time, I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. All right, David, thank you. Shay, would you like to say something before I open the floor to questions?
No. You know what? I could only second. Maybe I'll say something from the perspective of a student of Soviet history. We may be able to divide anti-Semites to two types. The type that is an anti-Semite who is comfortable with that, and the type that's not comfortable with that, who is uncomfortable with being an anti-Semite. So the Hamas, we mentioned Said Qutb, the ideological leader of the Islamic Brotherhood, the Hezbollah, the Islamic Jihad, they are very comfortable. They are self-proclaimed anti-Semites. They are very comfortable hating Jews and letting the world know that this is what they're about. The Soviet regime really stood for an ideology that was egalitarian, where at some point anti-Semitism was banned in the Soviet Union. You could actually, attack a Jew even verbally, and face legal consequences. So what I think we can see is that anti-Semitism is perhaps the longest trend. It crosses boundaries, historical boundaries. It transitions from antiquity to the Middle Ages to the modern period. We really see how in the Soviet Union, even though officially anti-Semitism had no place, anti-Semitic education had no place, society was still infested with preconceived ideas about Jews.
Okay. Thank you, Shay. So we have several questions. I see Holly Hadji has a question, and then David Mayer. These are two questions I see. So Holly, the floor is yours. And then I see Bernard is raising his hand as well. So Holly, then David, and then Bernard. And if Ellen, you have a question as well. I don't see everybody on the same screen. I'm doing my best, so I'm trying to keep them.
That's why I tried to do a thumbs up. I like that idea, whoever made that suggestion. Thank you for allowing me to ask a question. Dr. Patterson, wonderful presentation, just like last year. I have a question. After having a year in teaching a course and also doing active social justice work, a lot of the circles that I'm working in, especially to fight racism, are pro-Nation of Islam. Also, in my classroom, which is predominantly African-American, I have students who are either members of the nation or their parents are members of the nation or they have a positive view. often when I explain to them that Farrakhan and other members of the nation, that it's very anti-Semitic, even showing them speeches, they are very resistant. Even Christian ministers will post Farrakhan speeches and praise him. Can you please talk a little bit about the connections between more of the traditional or mainstream Islamicist groups and Muslim groups, and how that translates into an offshoot group such as the Nation of Islam, and the ongoing, I'm trying to think, was it Father's Day? It was during the quarantine, the pandemic. Farrakhan did a big speech and it was just full of anti-Semitism. It was during close in the summer, because I was teaching in the summer about racism. So could you talk a little bit about those connections for everyone, and how we can navigate that, especially when we're speaking with students who might be very sympathetic for other reasons, for other things the Nation of Islam that's been positive in their communities, how we can kind of translate and navigate that. Thank you.
It was the July 4th speech by Farrakhan. I'm going to try and put it on the chat. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, it's an eye-opening speech, but from the same script that he's followed for years. With regard to Nation of Islam embraces color as a value. In principle, Islamic jihadists like Sayyid Qutb and the others are not concerned with color. Okay. To the extent that color has value attached to it, we slip easily not just into racism, but into anti-Semitism. Some forms of anti-Semitism, some reasons for hating the Jews and Jewish teaching, is that it undermines making color of value. So according to Jewish teaching, the dearness of the other human being does not lie in anything that meets the eye, or nothing that can be weighed, measured, or counted. No, it's not skin color, it's not how fat or thin, smart or dumb, old or young anyone is. It's an inherent holiness, okay? It's a transcendent holiness that we encounter as a commandment to help. Emmanuel Levinas once said that to behold the face is to not even notice the color of the eyes, because the face is the emanation of holiness that lays claim to me to help. I would add, to be the face is to not even notice the color of the skin. So the seduction of Nation of Islam, I think, is the way in which it attaches value to color. And this is, I'm very nervous about the current discourse about the white-black dichotomy, and the idea that Jews are white because they are oppressors, and therefore they're in the wrong, they're evil. I think attaching good and evil to color is always a very dangerous affair, and it's and it often comes in the wake of anti-Semitism. I think racism is a form of anti-Semitism.
Thank you, David. I posted the Farrakhan speech from July the 4th. David Mayer, you have a question?
Okay, I'm unmuted. With respect to the historical pieces that were presented, it does seem that we would be better served down the road, and one can only do so much in a short presentation, of kind of acknowledging the breaks and let's call it the transition points, because it's not a linear movement from let's call it one attitude to another in the Middle East. For example, we know that the Einsatzgruppen had already been formed and the commander chosen to go to the Middle East for the express purpose of exterminating the Jews. And the only reason why they didn't go was because Rommel was turned around at Al-Alamein. We know that. So that means that comments to the Muslims that the Jews are theirs is simply a political ploy to get them to cause domestic unrest, when in fact, the Germans have no intention of letting the Arabs simply kill the Jews on their own. The Germans are planning to do it and that's the facts. But the other feature that goes with this is the references to the broadcasts in Arabic. When Jeffrey Herf did his research into that arena initially, what he found was that those broadcasts were evaluated by the Germans because they wanted to know the extent to which the resources that they were putting into them were actually having a resonance with the regional population. And that, oddly enough, was precisely what the British were interested in after World War II, when they reviewed the very same files and came to the conclusion that the influence, the impact, was very little. The fact, however, of let's call it the Nazi component, does come out later. People like Harhabi and his work, Arab Attitudes Towards Jews, clearly documents all of the features that you have outlined relating to translating Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But there's a gap. It is not a straight line of continuity from Hitler to the Muslim Brotherhood to the present. There's something else that takes place there, and we need to know what that is. Could you elaborate?
You want me to elaborate?
Yes, please.
On the historical moments? Yeah, well, as you point out, it's, I mean, there's very little time to cover a lot of history, but yeah, there were plans in place. There were killing units stationed, ready to go first into Egypt and then into Palestine. They were getting, I mentioned the Arabic language broadcasts that Al-Husseini did, which were sent, you know, into the North Africa and Palestine. And the radio was the main source of information there, as in many other parts of the world. So the Nazis were preparing the ground. Notice also that when they send Al-Husseini to Baghdad on April 3rd, 1941, they're preparing a larger movement to the east. They were coordinating, trying to establish a stronghold in Iraq with the movement to the east for various reasons, I think, military and otherwise. So there are huge patterns at work. And the patterns take you know, a long time to develop and elaborate. But when I teach the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, one of the things I try to impress upon my students is the importance of knowing history. If we don't know history, we can't make sense of anything. And I think that's why, you know, partly why this history of the modern jihadist phenomenon is very important. I mentioned the Salafist origins of the Muslim Brotherhood. Rashid Rida was a big influence on Hassan al-Banna. Rashid Rida was one of the original Salafists of the 19th century. So yeah, Dave, I appreciate the points that you make. I'm not sure what more to add. Right.
Just as a quick thought, why would we have decades and several governments saying that those broadcasts had a negligible influence? and they were declassified in 1970, and then they sat there for decades with people to review. And
yeah, well, I don't, Haj Amin al-Husseini is not studied very thoroughly in Holocaust studies. If you go to conferences on the Holocaust, as I have, and I'm sure you have, David, you don't find many papers on Haj Amin al-Husseini, do you? If you go through the museums, you don't see much on Haj Amin al-Husseini. It's a sensitive topic. It's a sensitive matter because he's a Muslim, frankly, and you're playing with something very volatile there when you go there. I mean, many people don't realize that there are quite a number of cases of Palestinians who name their kids Hitler, right? Yasser Arafat in October 1946 was taken under al-Husseini's wing in Egypt, and Yasser Arafat received his indoctrination and military training from the Muslim Brotherhood. When he founded Fatah in 1959, it was with the counsel of Haj Amin al-Husseini. And Fatah, of course, is still alive and well.
David, I think we're going to stop there because we have a lot of questions. This is very important, both Davids, thank you. And I'll just say very quickly, Jeffrey Herf and Ulrika Becker, who was a student of mine, wrote very well on these issues on the radio broadcast of the Nazis into the Middle East. So Bernard, a quick question, please, and then we have Ellen and Chanel, and we don't have much time, so please be concise in your questions and in the responses.
Thank you. Professor Patterson, thank you for such a wonderful lecture. You mentioned the fact that anti-Semitism is not a political or social phenomenon, it is a metaphysical phenomenon. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. Is it some kind of curse? Are you referring to some kind of curse or something? What exactly is the core of that statement? It's a metaphysical phenomenon.
Well, okay, excellent question. The core, at the core is the original temptation, namely the temptation to be God. Rabbi Zweig spoke beautifully about this. And I wrote a book called Anti-Semitism and Its Metaphysical Origins, in which I go into this at great length. But I think it's driven by a desire to be God, and which requires the elimination of God. As Rabbi Zweig pointed out, Amalek attacked Israel, starting with the children and the elders, in an effort to kill God. It has social manifestations. It has political manifestations. It has various manifestations. It comes in various forms of dress, okay? But I think at the core of it is this desire to get rid of God, to get rid of the one who asked me, like he asked Adam, where are you? Like he asked Cain, where's your brother? So that's what I have in mind by metaphysics. I don't know, it's not a curse, but it's part of it's in the soul. I don't see anti-Semitism as a we versus they affair. I think it lurks in me, okay? I think our vigilance, I'm just speaking for myself, my vigilance has to begin with myself and my own attitudes, my own way I talk, my own actions. So that's what, as a first principle, it comes from the garden. You will be like God, but you're going to have to kill God to be like God.
And if I can add, the two great atheist or godless regimes of the 20th century, the Nazi regime and the communist regime in Russia, you can think about how less they have in common. That's something that they did have in common. I mean, in both of them, it was, perhaps you could say that human figures assumed divine significance. I mean, you could see Stalin and Hitler as being seen as more than human beings within both systems. But these are two regimes. So I actually would like to second what Professor Patterson said, that here you have a case of a regime that, or it's not about ideology, and when it can actually, when anti-Semitism can manifest itself in different dresses in different eras, but the paradigm of Yaakov and Esav remains. This is not something, when I mention Yaakov and Esav, it's not something that I dealt with as a scholar, but as a human being and as a Holocaust educator, I came to the conclusion that ideologies tackle anti-Semitism only on a very superficial level. This is really what explains the puzzle of anti-Semitism in the very heart, in the very midst of the Soviet, of communist ideology, which was all about battling anti-Semitism.
Okay, thank you, Shay. Ellen, the floor is yours for your question. Please be concise. We're running low on time.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank Shay and David for masterful presentations.
Thank you.
I'd also like to ask a question to get back to Charles's question about how do we deal with this complexity that we're looking at, and to also relate my question to Professor Wolf's comments. Professor Wolf made it very clear to us that when we're looking at forms of authoritarianism today or in contemporary times, that the base is what is being formulated. That is, it has to have particular language to get people to then act in a certain way. So when we're looking at the 38 tapes that were played from Berlin to the Arab world, the audience was the non-educated. They understood that audience was non-educated, and they used music. They also used prayers, but at the end of each of the messages to the illiterate community listening from Berlin to the Arab world was, pick up your guns, go out now and kill the Jews, after every single one of these tapes. But when we're looking at higher education, and we're looking at the intellectual elite that are training professionals of the future, we're looking at a totally different vehicle of language, of the encasing of that language in a different verbiage. And I want to know, again, when we have two different institutions, it's very, very, very complex, but the language and the way that intellectuals are now using this complexity as a litmus test. Are you in as an intellectual, or are you a pariah? Also, this is very, very confusing. So when we ask the question, Charles' ultimate question is, how do we deal with contemporary? We find that when they were dealing with the original tapes to the non-educated, it became a more simplified use of language. But today's is much more complex, and the vehicle of omitting opposing views is growing. So how do we deal with contemporary anti-Semitism?
I'll let David answer.
Thanks. Well, again, it's by exposing what is driving anti-Semitism. It entails, anti-Semitism, again, entails either the appropriation of God or the usurpation of God, the eclipse of God, becoming like God. It has to be totalitarian. It has to be exposed as a form of totalitarianism, so that there can be no tolerance for other points of view. And the more extreme it is, the more totalitarian it becomes. And what happens in academia in many quarters is that we've become very sophisticated when it comes to shutting down opposing points of view. We couch our moral indignation in the language of intellectual sophistication, okay? So not only am I smarter than you, I'm better than you, and I have to shut you up for the good of everyone. So yeah, this is not like the beer hall rabble-rousers. It's very sophisticated. People like Edward Said, very sophisticated. Foucault, very sophisticated. Seductive, very seductive. We all want to be thought of as smart. Nobody wants to be thought of as smart more than a graduate student, and those of us who went to graduate school know that. So we want to be able to at least drop the name of Heidegger and Foucault and so on. But we're easily intimidated. It's a tall order because, I mean, we all know, I mean, Ellen, you know, people whose careers have been jeopardized by saying something. I have friends who have lost jobs for saying something about this matter. Ask Charles, my best friend, my closest friend, has dealt with this up close and personal. So I don't know, I would say another thing that's required for dealing with it is courage, which is always in short supply. I'm sorry to be of so little help to you.
Well, David, yeah, so I think many of us who are dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism in academia have paid a price, but you know, something higher than a few letters next to our names, I suspect. So Chanel, you have the last question of this session, and then we're going to break with some music for an hour. So Chanel, unmute yourself. Great.
Okay, great. Thank you both. My question is about memory. So with Dr. Pilnik, you were saying, talking about the erasure of Babi Yar, I'm curious how, if at all, you believe that the memory, the painful memory of erasing the past, how that's impacting the sense of Russian identity now, not just Jewish identity, because I think a lot of Jews still struggle with events of the Holocaust and transgenerational trauma and everything, but do young Russian Jews feel safe, or do they feel that their history has been manipulated by their own government? And I'm just curious how those two concepts have interacted with one another.
So my work was more of the work of a historian. I little looked into the contemporary use of Babi Yar, and also as I see in the comments, this use is ongoing. Babi Yar is actually now the epicenter of a new memorial center that embroiled both Russian philanthropists, Russian Jewish philanthropists, the Ukrainian government, the Jewish organizations. You can still see that the question of how to most effectively commemorate Babi Yar is still a mess. And I would say that it's a subject that does not bring together. It would naturally not bring together Ukrainians, Russians, and Jews, but rather pull them apart just because of the different historical point of views and identities that we all have. I had a very interesting question before about collaboration. The Soviet regime punished collaborators, but in the Ukraine it had a great trouble to do so effectively because there were so many collaborators. So what do you do when you have in a certain town one person who was a collaborator? You proceed with a summary trial and public hanging. But what do you do when almost everyone is complicit? When so many people in one way or another take part in it? Then the response of the Soviet regime was precisely to silence this whole subject because it was so inconvenient for many. there is no Holocaust education in Russia today as much as there is in the United States. You do see the term Shoah and Holocaust with the Russian Ech, with the letter Ha, going on steroids during the time of the Glasnost and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, the Shoah, any kind of engagement in Shoah then becomes a trope for Russian Jewish identity and Ukrainian Jewish identity. I would say that, you know, Jews today in Russia, they no longer live in a Soviet reality, even though we do see the, you know, the reemergence of a new Cold War between the West and Russia. Russian Jews can go to Israel, they can visit the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC, they can go to a seminar at Yad Vashem and come back. They can have work in Russian NGOs, they can be a part of a Russian Jewish community. At the same time, the official Russian narrative, and this came into play with sort of a scandal that happened with Russian involvement with Yad Vashem when Putin came to visit Israel earlier. The Russian point of view of what happened during World War II on Russian soil, on Soviet soil, is still very much of an attempt to gloss over the fact that so many Russians and Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, but particularly, I would say Ukrainians, were involved in collaboration. The Russian population, by the way, was also to a lesser degree involved with collaboration with the Nazis. The Russian regime today is trying to say, you know what, Russia can clean out of it. We always supported Jews. It was only the fascist Lithuanians and Latvians and Ukrainians who had anything to do with it. We can still see how the present conflicts are projected onto the past in order to become useful to current regimes. The young Jews in Russia who go to a public school and learn about World War II would not feel much, I don't think, even though I did not professionally research it, they would not feel far more comfortable than my parents growing up in the Soviet Union and learning about the Suez War in 1956 and learning basically that they do not belong and their home is elsewhere. I don't think that this is, that much has fundamentally changed.
Thank you.
Okay, Shay, thank you. Shay Pilnik and David Patterson, thank you very much for your wonderful contribution. We really appreciate it. Thanks for being here. Shay will be starting a new Center of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University, and I think people could contact him there if he has any. If you have any questions. And interesting, I know there's some scholars who are here from historically Black colleges. Yeshiva University has a similar history in some ways, and I think it's actually having a bit of a resurgence. It was once perceived as sort of this parochial Jewish institution, but now because of the climate in academia, all sorts of Jewish scholars and Israeli scholars are flocking to Yeshiva University, and it's changing. So it could be, there's a similar patterns, and Yeshiva is becoming I think a very exciting place, and Shay will be there.
We're looking for students, so please spread the word. We will have an MA and a certificate for teachers in Holocaust studies, and we already have 2 courses, one taught by me, taught online, offered online, so anyone can take them in the fall of 2020.
Cool.
Thank you for your participation.
10% finder's fee for all tuition. I'm kidding. And David, thanks very much, David, for your wisdom and your experience in this complicated area. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a